In the first part of this two-part study, we looked at how the philosophy of how one approaches translations shapes how one renders the syntax and how one chooses the words that one employs in a translation. And we saw that these choices help determine the differences between individual translations that we see when we pick them up and read them. In this section, we're going to ask the question, how do we go about studying a text using more than one translation? And what kind of resources can we use to assist us in that study? In the last part of the study, we observed that the biggest mistake most people make when they approach studying the Bible and comparing translations is that they stop at the point of deciding which translation they like better. And they often are unable to really articulate why they like a translation better, and um, they don't really understand the fact that just because you like the way it sounds better, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best rendering of the underlying text. So, the solution to this problem is to compare translations and to compare them in such a way that it helps lead you to a better understanding of what the author originally intended to communicate. Now, we've already dealt with the question of why some translations differ from one another. And we noted that one very fundamental reason that they differ is that they employ different translational philosophies. And so I'm not going to deal here with the implications of that because we talked about that already in the previous video. But another reason that translations differ is that translators simply choose a different gloss. That is, they choose a different word in the English text to reflect a word in the original text, the Greek or Hebrew of the Bible. And again, we talked about that a little bit in the previous session about the question of whether one chooses whether one chooses an etymologically driven word or whether one chooses a significance driven gloss. Another reason that translations differ is that the translators are actually reading a different text. That is to say, they disagree about which words actually belong in the original biblical text. Another reason that translations differ is that translators actually understand the meaning of the grammar or syntax differently. And the fifth reason that translations differ is that translators have come to different conclusions about the significance or meaning, if you will, of a word in the original text. So I want to go through these five differences and talk and give some examples of them and talk about how we can identify them and how we can then study them, even if we can't necessarily read the text for ourselves in the original language. So, we've already dealt with the problem of different translational philosophies. And we need to remember that when approaching this, it's not the goal of our interest to simply decide which translation we like best. Rather, the goal is to understand the text better by a careful reflection on what a variety of careful and reflective readers have found when they're reading the text. So, in our previous video, we looked at this example from Psalm 7, the problem of how you translate these two Hebrew words in Psalm 7, verse 10 in the Hebrew text or verse 9 in the English text. And we saw that employing different approaches led translators to render these in a variety of different ways, some more etymologically driven and some more significance driven based on the context. And so, um, as we study a text, we have to keep in mind that our goal is not simply to decide which of those kinds of phrases we like better, but which actually reflects the meaning or intention of the author better. The second goal is to identify those things in the text that require additional study in order to understand what's being said. And some of these things that require additional study may be etymological, they may be word related, and some may be grammar or syntax related. And we'll touch on those as we go forward. So, uh, with that in mind, let's turn to the differences. We've already touched on different translational philosophies, as I said, so we won't deal with that one again. But let's deal with what happens when a translator chooses a different gloss, that is to say, a different English word to represent an underlying word in the original text. And again, here I'm going to use a Hebrew example. In this case, the challenge of a word found in Exodus 24, verse 8. In that verse, the ESV reads, Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, Behold the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you in accordance with these words. And I want to focus for a moment on the word threw. Moses took the blood and threw it on the people. And if we compare this with other translations, we would find that the word throw is used by a number. Even more have chosen the English word sprinkle. A couple have selected splattered as an English word, and others have used splashed, and some have even used dashed. So when you see this, as you compare translations, what do? How do you understand what's going on here? Well, part of this is understanding the concept of a semantic field of a word. So the Hebrew word here is zarach. And, if you don't know Hebrew, don't worry about it. This is simply the Hebrew word, the verb that's used here. And if we look at all of the ways that this particular verb zarach is used in the Bible, the Hebrew of the Bible, we would find that sometimes sprinkle is an appropriate word, sometimes splash would be an appropriate word, sometimes toss would be an appropriate word, sometimes throw, sometimes scatter, and so forth. And there are others that we could choose in English as well. Notice how these tend to fall into two sorts of groups. Toss and throw and scatter are words that we might use in English, but don't necessarily fit the context here all that well. We use the word toss in English, like tossing a ball back and forth or throwing a ball back and forth. Scatter implies that we're, distributing something in a sort of random way. And that's possible for the verb even here, but not as likely. So more commonly would be, we might choose words like sprinkle or splash or maybe throw to indicate, these are words that are typically more used with liquids than with solids. And since we're talking about blood here, we might choose one of them instead. So, how do you sort out whether the difference between the choice of words in an English translation is appropriate or not? Well, one thing you might do is to consult lexicons. A lexicon is a dictionary and a dictionary of the choices of words from biblical languages. We usually call those lexicons. And you typically go word by word and list the word and give you examples of the various translational choices. And again, as you look through these, it's not a matter of picking the one that you like the best. It's a matter of finding how the context uh, that is chosen best aligns with the context of the word, or I'm sorry, the context of the verse that you're translating. Another kind of resource that you could use would be things like the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament or a Theological Dictionary of the New Testament or other theological word books. These go into more detail. They're typically more descriptive. They explain why you might want to choose one over another, but they have their own challenges. Sometimes they're a little more difficult to follow if you don't have a significant background in the languages involved. If you use software, you could use something like the Bible Word Study tool that's used in Logos Bible software that will help you sort through the way that the word is used in various places that it occurs in the Bible. And you can go to commentaries. Often a commentary writer will explain why, in his view, one English word is a better choice than another English word in a particular case. Now, most commentators don't discuss every word, but if it's a word that's particularly theologically important or significant in the context, there's a good chance that a number of commentators will discuss it. So, those are kind of things that you can look at when you're exploring why translators have chosen a different gloss. A third reason that translations differ is that translators are actually sometimes reading simply a different text from one another. So this raises the whole question of the role of textual variants. Now, here I'm going to look at a famously problematic passage from the Old Testament, 1 Samuel 13, verses 1 to 2. The ESV of this passage reads, Saul lived for 1 year and then became king. And when he had reigned for 2 years over Israel, Saul chose 3,000 men of Israel. And then the text goes on from there. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that it the Bible elsewhere suggests that Saul reigned for a longer period of time, and the actual Hebrew here is a little more problematic. The ESV has tried to smooth it out a little bit and make sense of the text as it occurs in Hebrew. But let's compare that to the NIV. The NIV says Saul was 30 years old when he became king and reigned over Israel 42 years. And then Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. So this is a very different reading than the ESV has. Saul lived for 1 year and then became king. He reigned over Israel 42 years. So very, very different translations of this phrase. The problem is that if you look at the Hebrew underlying this, then the first phrase, Saul lived for 1 year, as the ESV translates it, really normally is the kind of phrase that in Hebrew means somebody was 1 year old. Saul was 1 year old when he became king. And that's clearly not true from the rest of the biblical narrative. And so, even though there's no actual text that has a different reading from this, most translators believe that the Hebrew text is problematic here and that some words have probably been lost from it in the process of translation. The second phrase is also similarly problematic. And so we get, for example, the King James Version reads, Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, again, that doesn't make very good sense in English at all. So if we look at another translation, the New American Standard Bible says, when Saul was 30 years old, he began to reign, and he reigned 42 years over Israel. Notice that they've put uh, the words 30 and 40 in italics to indicate that they're not actually in the text, but they have supplied what they think is missing in the text in this case. Same way if we look at the New English translation, the Net Bible. They say Saul was 30 years old when he began to reign, and notice they have 30 in brackets, and he ruled over Israel 40 years. And here they put the word 40 in brackets. So again, they're trying to reconcile this problematic text with the rest of the biblical narrative and make sense of it. But they realize that to do that, they have to substitute something that's not in the text for something that is actually there. Finally, let's look at the New Jerusalem Bible. The New Jerusalem Bible simply says uh, Saul was years old when he became king and reigned over Israel years. So they've handled the problem here differently. They've just kind of, by putting an ellipsis in, said, we don't know what the right reading is, and we're just going to leave it blank. And That's also a fair and honest intellectual approach, although it might well disturb some people who typically would read the text. The Tanakh version by the Jewish Publication Society does something similar. They leave an ellipsis as regards the age of Saul, but they stick with the 2 years of the text in the second part. So these are various ways that translations deal with the fact that they're actually reading a different text from one another. So how do you approach resolving this kind of question? Well, you probably the best resource for this is commentaries. Most more academically oriented commentaries would certainly explain the problem to you and give you some reasons why you might think one way or another. I think study Bible notes will sometimes do this as well. And in this case, the Net Bible, the New English Translation Bible, does a really good job in its study Bible notes, which are free online, by the way, of explaining the problems. And whether or not you agree with their solution, at least you'll understand what the issue is that's shaping the way the translator approached his task. So those are some things you can do uh, to resolve a difficulty when you encounter translations that are actually reading a different kind of text. The fourth way that translations differ is that when translators understand the grammar or syntax of a passage differently. So here we can turn to the very first verse in the Bible for an example, Genesis 1:1. The ESV translates this in a very straightforward way. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, period. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the deep, and the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters, period. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, period. So, three sentences, each with an independent thought. Now, if we compare this with the translation by the Jewish Publication Society, the Tanakh, we can see a significant difference immediately. They translate the first phrase, not in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, but when God began to create the heavens and the earth. And without going into detail, the reason is because they understand the grammar of the Hebrew differently than the translators of the ESV. And then the problem becomes a little more complex. The next thought is treated by the ESV as a separate sentence, a complete sentence and a separate thought, whereas the Tanakh translation treats it as an insertion, an interruption in the thought of the original sentence. Notice the sentence begins, when God began to create the heavens and the earth. That's not a complete thought, that's just a temporal clause at the beginning. And so for the translators of the Tanakh, the thought of the original phrase is not completed until you get to the end. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So the translators of the Tanakh would read this as, when God began to create the heavens and the earth, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And then everything in between is an excursus or an insertion that gives us some additional information about the situation at the moment God began to create the heavens and the earth, or when God began to create the heavens and the earth. That's a very different understanding of the underlying grammar and syntax than the ESV, which is a very traditional translation and treats each of these thoughts as being independent. So this is a problem in understanding how the syntax and grammar of the original source language operates. And because the translators have understood that grammar and syntax differently, they've rendered it differently in English. So, what kind of resources would you use to find out about this? Well, again, probably your best choice here would be commentaries. Most commentary writers will deal with this. Some will deal with it at great length. And of course, commentaries come to different conclusions about which one is correct. And also, study Bible notes like those in the Net Bible that we talked about before can be very helpful. And then you might want to go further, particularly if you know, in this case, the Hebrew of the Old Testament. You could go further and consult reference grammars and look into the grammatical issues for yourself and come to your own conclusion about which of those two approaches you think are more likely. And by the way, uh, when I say reference grammars, I do mean advanced reference grammars, not the kind of grammar that you're using to learn a language originally. A reference grammar is something more like an encyclopedia than it is an introduction to a topic, and they tend to deal with bigger problems. Whereas introductory grammars just give you an overview of the way the language works. A reference grammar will often explore problems in great detail. So that's what happens when translators understand the grammar or syntax of a passage differently. The fifth way that translations differ is that they draw different conclusions about the significance of the words that are in the original text. So here, let's look at an example from Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 28. The Hebrew reads, Anachnu Olim. And here I'm going to kind of go word by word. Ana would typically be an interrogative word, where. Anachnu, we. Olim. Here, this is the participle of the verb to go up. So if we were looking at word by word, the Hebrew would say, where we going up. And so the ESV reads this as, where are we going up? Meaning, exactly what's the location that we are going up. Either going up from or going up to is not clear from the ESV's rendering. The CSB, the Christian Study Bible, takes a different approach. It renders this, where can we go? Hebrew doesn't have, remember, modal aspects like the subjunctive. And for those, uh, we have to supply those in English, and that's what they've done in this case. The Hebrew Bible Society's translation of the Tanakh takes again a different significance and renders this, what kind of place are we going to? In other words, they understand the word where to be not asking the location, but asking the character of the place to which they're going. And the Net Bible actually then reads, what is going to happen to us? Where are we going is not asking sort of the nature of the trip they're on, but rather what's going to happen to us uh, as we go on our journey. Now, I'm not going to sort through these for you and attempt to answer them because it's too complex of a problem. I just want you to see, in this case, the nature of the difficulty that arises because translators have a different conclusion about the significance of a word in a particular place. So, again, what kind of resources could you use to examine this problem? Well, here one might look first at something like study Bible notes, where again the Net Bible study notes are really pretty good in dealing with these kinds of questions. Commentaries are obviously another place that one would look at. And of course, I don't have it on the list here, but it's obvious that one might look at lexicons as well to sort through the different kinds of senses that can be associated with each individual word. The important thing is to understand that these kinds of differences arise when translators come to different conclusions about the significance of the words. So as you study a translation, you want to read it with these five things in mind. And where you encounter differences in between translations, it's often very helpful to try to say, what's the cause of this difference? Is it that they are employing a different philosophy, or just chosen a different gloss, or is there a different underlying text, or is this a grammar or syntax issue? What exactly is going on that leads to the different rendering in the different translations? And it's exploring those questions that will take you deeper into the word and help you understand what the author is intentionally saying. So the goal, remember, is not simply to decide which of these translations you like the best. Rather, it's to understand the text better by careful reflection uh, based on a variety of careful and reflective readings of the text, and to identify those things in the text that require further study, and then to follow up by studying them. So that's the way that one can work with translations in the most productive way in order to achieve a better understanding of what the Word of God says. Thank you for joining me for this two-part look at how we work with translations. And I hope that as a result of thinking about these things, you'll have a better understanding of what translations do and why they're doing them. Thank you.